Mom still thinks this house belongs to her, my daughter whispered behind my back during my birthday lunch. The table went quiet for half a second before everyone laughed softly into their wine glasses. I kept smiling as if I hadn't heard a thing. But what Claire didn't know was that 48 hours earlier, I had already signed the documents that would change all of their lives forever. I turned 68 on a rainy Thursday in late October. The kind of cold New England afternoon where the trees looked bare and elegant at the same time. Claire insisted on taking me to lunch at Bellamy's, a lakeside restaurant about 20 miles outside Hartford. You deserve something special this year, Mom, she'd said over the phone earlier that week, her voice unusually sweet. I should have recognized the sweetness for what it was. Claire only sounded that warm when she wanted something. Still, I said yes. Mothers do that. Even after disappointment becomes a pattern, some small part of you still hopes the next invitation will feel different. I spent extra time getting ready that morning. I curled my silver hair carefully and wore the dark green wool dress Harold used to love. My late husband always said green brought out the color in my eyes. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, fastening my pearl earrings with slightly trembling fingers, I caught myself smiling at the memory of him. It had been 4 years since Harold passed, but some mornings I still expected to hear his footsteps downstairs. The restaurant overlooked Lake Whitmore. Gray water. Gray sky. The kind of quiet scenery that makes people speak softer without realizing it. Claire and Daniel were already seated when I arrived. My granddaughter Sophie sat beside them scrolling through her phone. "Grandma," she said immediately, standing to hug me properly. She was the only one who still hugged me like family instead of obligation. Claire barely looked up from the cocktail menu. "You made it," she said. "Traffic wasn't too terrible?" I smiled and slid into the chair at the end of the table. Not the center seat. Not beside Sophie. The end. Small details reveal big truths eventually. I noticed things more. These days. The way Daniel kept checking his watch whenever I spoke. The way Claire answered questions for everyone else before they had a chance to respond themselves. The way Sophie stayed unusually quiet whenever her mother started talking about money. Lunch arrived quickly. Lobster rolls. Salmon salad. A 12-ounce fillet for Daniel. Expensive meals ordered without even glancing at the prices. Claire lifted her champagne glass halfway through lunch. "To Mom," she announced brightly. "The strongest woman I know." Everyone raised their glasses. I noticed Daniel smirk slightly into his drink. Sophie looked uncomfortable. "Thank you," I said softly. Claire reached across the table and squeezed my hand for exactly 2 seconds before letting go. Long enough for appearances. That was Claire's talent. She understood appearances better than sincerity. Halfway through dessert, I excused myself to the restroom. On my way back, I slowed near the hallway leading to the private dining rooms when I heard Claire's voice drifting around the corner. "Honestly, once she signs the paperwork, we can probably list the property before Christmas." Daniel chuckled quietly. "Does she even realize how much the house is worth now?" Then Claire laughed. Low. Cold. Familiar. Mom still thinks this house belongs to her. A few people nearby laughed politely with her. My feet stopped moving. Not because I was shocked. Shock comes when truth arrives unexpectedly. This wasn't unexpected anymore. It was confirmation. I stood there for a moment staring at the framed painting on the wall across from me. A little sailboat drifting through foggy water. Calm on the surface. Lost underneath. Then I adjusted the sleeve of my coat and walked back to the table with a smile so steady even I almost believed it. Claire looked up immediately. "Everything okay, Mom?" she asked. "Perfect," I replied calmly. Sophie glanced at me carefully. Smart girl. She sensed things other people missed. The waiter arrived carrying a small birthday cake with a single candle glowing softly in the center. Everyone sang. Claire loudest of all. I folded my hands together beneath the table and watched the flame flicker. Then I made my wish quietly. Not for revenge. Not even for justice. Just clarity. Because by then, I finally understood something painful about family. The people who betray you rarely think they're doing anything wrong. They convince themselves they deserve what you built. And Claire had already convinced herself that my home, my savings, my entire life belonged to her. What she didn't know was that 2 mornings earlier, I had sat inside Thomas Reed's law office for nearly 3 hours. And when I walked out of that building, Claire Dawson stopped being the future owner of anything I had. I did not say much during the drive home. Claire talked the entire time from the front passenger seat, while Daniel focused on the road with both hands gripping the steering wheel like he was late for something important. Sophie sat beside me in the back seat, quiet, occasionally glancing over as if she wanted to ask whether I was all right. Outside the window, the rain had started again, thin streaks sliding down the glass. Hartford looked washed out and tired under the gray afternoon sky. The market is unbelievable right now, Claire said casually. Homes near the lake are selling in less than a week. Daniel nodded. Especially properties with large lots. I watched the windshield wipers move back and forth in steady rhythm. Claire spoke about real estate the same way other people talked about weather. Light, casual, detached from emotion. But I knew exactly why she kept bringing it up. My house sat on almost 2 acres overlooking the river. Harold bought the property in 1984, when land still cost less than people expected it to. Back then the neighborhood was quiet. Families stayed for decades. Children rode bicycles until sunset. Harold planted maple trees along the driveway himself the first summer we moved in. They were towering now. Strong. Older than Claire's marriage. Mom. Claire turned slightly in her seat. You are still coming Sunday, right? Sunday. I asked calmly. Family dinner, she replied. We need to discuss a few things before the holidays. Few things. That was how Claire described life-changing decisions now. Like rearranging furniture. I smiled faintly. Of course. Sophie looked down at her phone immediately after I answered. Another small detail. Another silence that felt too heavy for a 16-year-old girl to carry comfortably. When we finally reached my house, Daniel stayed in the car while Claire walked me to the front porch with exaggerated concern. Do you need help getting inside? She asked. I am 68, Claire, I said gently. Not 98. She laughed too loudly. You know what I mean. I unlocked the front door slowly. The porch light flickered above us. Harold always meant to replace that bulb before he got sick. Funny the things that remain unfinished after someone dies. Claire leaned closer and lowered her voice slightly. Mom, you know we are only trying to help you, right? There it was. The sentence people use when they have already decided what is best for your life without asking permission first. I nodded once. I know exactly what you are trying to do. For half a second her expression tightened. Then the smile returned immediately. Polished. Practiced. Good, she said softly. I just do not want you overwhelmed anymore. She kissed my cheek and walked back toward the car. I stood there on the porch until the taillights disappeared down the street. Then I stepped inside the house and closed the door behind me. Silence settled around me instantly. Real silence. Not the tense kind from restaurants and family dinners. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily. The living room smelled faintly like cedarwood and old books. Harold's reading chair still sat beside the fireplace exactly where he left it 4 years ago. Some people told me I should redecorate after he passed. Move on. Make the house feel new again. But grief does not work like that when you spend 43 years loving someone. Certain rooms become sacred without trying. I removed my coat carefully and draped it over the hallway bench. Then I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. A small chocolate cake sat on the middle shelf beside leftover soup from earlier that week. Claire had forgotten to send me home with the birthday cake from lunch. Or maybe she had not forgotten at all. Poured myself a cup of tea and stood by the kitchen window watching rain collect along the patio stones outside. My reflection stared back faintly against the dark glass. Tired eyes. Silver hair. A woman my daughter believed had become weak enough to manipulate. I took a slow sip of tea. Then I walked into Harold's old study and opened the top drawer of his desk. The folder Thomas Reed gave me 2 days earlier was still there exactly where I left it. Thick cream-colored paper. Official signatures. Final decisions. I rested my hand lightly against the folder for a moment and smiled to myself for the first time all day. Claire thought she was planning my future. What she did not realize was that her place in mine had already begun disappearing. Sunday dinner used to mean something different in this house. Years ago, Claire would arrive carrying fresh bread from the bakery downtown, while Harold grilled steaks on the back patio even during early fall weather. Sophie used to run through the kitchen in socks too slippery for the hardwood floors while Daniel pretended to complain about football scores from the living room. Back then, family dinners felt loud in the warm way. Natural. Imperfect. Alive. Now they felt organized. Controlled. Like meetings pretending to be memories. I spent most of Sunday afternoon preparing dinner anyway. Pot roast with carrots and onions. Homemade mashed potatoes. The same recipes Harold loved for almost 4 decades. Habit survives longer than hope sometimes. By 5:30, the dining room table was set. Cloth napkins folded neatly beside each plate. Candles glowing softly beneath the chandelier Harold installed himself during the winter of 1992. Outside, the maple trees along the driveway swayed under sharp October wind. The house felt too large before people arrived and strangely smaller once they did. Claire entered first carrying 2 bottles of wine she probably spent more money on than necessary. Daniel followed behind her checking emails on his phone. Sophie came in last with her backpack still hanging from one shoulder. "Something smells amazing," Sophie said immediately. "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied. Claire kissed my cheek. Quickly before walking straight into the dining room. "Mom, we really need to update this wallpaper eventually," she said casually while looking around the room. "It makes the house feel dated." I smoothed the edge of a napkin slowly. "Your father picked that wallpaper." Claire gave a small shrug. "Exactly." Daniel coughed awkwardly into his fist. Sophie stared at her mother for a moment before quietly taking her seat beside me. Dinner started politely enough. Safe conversation. School schedules. Weather forecasts. Daniel complaining about gas prices even though he drove a luxury SUV large enough to carry camping equipment for 12 people. Claire spent most of the meal talking about property values in neighboring towns. "You would not believe what the Henderson place sold for," she said while pouring herself another glass of wine. "Smaller lot than this house and still almost 1.3 million. I noticed she no longer said your house. Now it was this house. Distance hidden inside language. "That is a lot of money," I replied calmly. Claire smiled. "Exactly. Which is why timing matters in this market." Sophie lowered her fork quietly. "Mom." Claire ignored her completely. "Honestly, Mom, maintaining a property this size alone cannot be easy anymore." There it was again. Not concern. Positioning. Every conversation moved slowly toward the same destination now. Like furniture being pushed inch by inch toward a doorway. "I managed just fine," I said. Claire exchanged a glance with Daniel so quick most people would have missed it. I did not. Daniel cleared his throat. "Nobody is saying you cannot." "Then what exactly are you saying?" Silence settled over the table immediately. Claire reached for her wine glass before speaking again, her voice softer this time. More careful. "We just worry about you." Sophie let out the faintest sigh beside me. Teenagers recognize dishonesty faster than adults sometimes, because they have not spent years learning to politely ignore it. I cut another piece of pot roast slowly and placed it on my plate before responding. "Funny," I said gently. "Your father used to say that real concern sounds very different from financial planning." Claire's expression tightened for half a second. Then she laughed lightly as though I had made a harmless joke. "You always know how to make things dramatic, Mom." Dramatic. Another word people use when they want your discomfort to feel inconvenient instead of justified. Dinner continued after that, but something had shifted. Daniel barely spoke. Claire smiled too much. Sophie pushed food around her plate without eating much at all. I noticed her checking her phone repeatedly beneath the table, her face pale in the candlelight. Then, just as I began clearing dishes, Sophie's phone buzzed loudly against the table beside her glass. She grabbed it too late. The screen lit up bright enough for me to see the message preview before she turned it over. It was from Claire. "Do not mention the assisted living place tonight. She is already emotional." For a moment nobody moved. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Wind brushed softly against the kitchen windows. Claire's face lost all color. Sophie looked horrified. Daniel stared down at his untouched potatoes like he wished he could disappear directly into them. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate and looked directly at my daughter for the first time all evening. "An assisted living place?" I asked quietly. Claire opened her mouth immediately. Mom, it is not what it sounds like. But the problem with truth is that once you finally see it clearly, every lie around it suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. Claire recovered first. She always did. That was one of the things that made her dangerous. Some people panic when they are caught in a lie. Claire simply reorganized the lie fast enough to make everyone else question what they saw. Mom, she said carefully, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle around the edges. You are misunderstanding the message. I remained seated at the table, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Sophie stared at her plate like she wished the floor would open beneath her chair. Daniel rubbed one hand across the back of his neck without speaking. Am I asked quietly. Claire inhaled slowly before sitting straighter in her chair. We were only discussing options for the future. That is all. Future. Another harmless-sounding word people hide selfishness inside. You have been alone since Dad passed, Claire continued. This house is too much responsibility now. We thought maybe somewhere smaller would make life easier for you. Easier. There it was again. Every sentence wrapped carefully in concern while greed sat underneath it like rot beneath floorboards. I looked around the dining room slowly. At the chandelier Harold installed with his own hands. At the framed photographs lining the far wall. Claire at age 10 holding a softball trophy almost bigger than her arms. Claire at 16 smiling nervously before prom. Claire in her white graduation gown after I worked 3 extra years instead of retiring so she could finish college debt-free. Funny how memory changes once betrayal enters the room. Suddenly old sacrifices stop feeling warm. They start feeling expensive. Do you remember the winter your apartment flooded? I asked softly. Claire blinked, caught off guard by the question. What? You and Daniel lived here for 8 months afterward, I continued calmly. Harold turned his workshop into a nursery for Sophie because you said the guest room felt too cold. Daniel looked down immediately. Claire crossed her arms. Defensive now. That was years ago. Yes, I replied. It was. I stood slowly and began gathering plates from the table one at a time. The house remained quiet except for silverware softly touching china. Sophie rose immediately to help me carry dishes into the kitchen. Claire stayed seated. Mom, nobody is attacking you, she said with growing irritation. You are making this emotional. Emotional. Dramatic. Overwhelmed. Old. Women hear certain words enough times and eventually realize they are not descriptions. They are strategies. Sophie rinsed dishes beside me quietly while Claire continued talking from the dining room. We are thinking logically here. That is all. You have a 4-bedroom house sitting on valuable land. Property taxes alone are almost $12,000 a year now. I dried my hands carefully with a kitchen towel before turning toward her. And yet I have managed to pay them. Claire opened her mouth, then closed it again. Daniel finally spoke for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. Maybe everybody should calm down. Sophie laughed once under her breath. Not because anything was funny, because she had finally become old enough to recognize cowardice when she heard it. Claire stood abruptly from the table and walked into the kitchen. You know what? She snapped. We are trying to help and somehow you are turning us into villains. I studied my daughter's face quietly. Her expensive coat draped over one arm. Perfect manicure. Diamond earrings Daniel could not actually afford without refinancing something every other year. Claire always liked looking successful more than being honest. Do you want to know the strange thing? I asked softly. I spent years believing you became colder after your father died. But now I think you were simply waiting until he was gone. Silence hit the room instantly. Sharp. Heavy. Claire's eyes widened with genuine offense. That is unbelievable. Is it? I asked. She stared at me for several long seconds before grabbing her purse from the dining room chair. Daniel, Sophie. We are leaving. Daniel stood immediately without argument. Sophie remained frozen beside the sink. Go ahead, she said quietly. Claire turned toward her daughter in disbelief. Excuse me. Sophie swallowed hard before speaking again. Grandma does not deserve this. Claire's expression darkened so quickly it almost startled me. Not rage. Worse. Embarrassment. The kind selfish people feel when someone finally says the truth out loud in front of witnesses. Get your things, Claire said coldly. Sophie looked at me first. Just for a second. Long enough for me to see fear mixed with guilt in her young face. Then she lowered her eyes and followed her parents toward the front door. A minute later, the house fell silent again except for the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the hallway. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the half-cleared dinner table. 3 untouched dinner rolls still sat in the basket beside melted butter. 1 wine glass remained half full near Claire's empty chair. I walked slowly into Harold's study afterward and sat down at his desk beneath the soft yellow glow of the reading lamp. Outside, wind rattled the maple branches against the windows. Inside the top drawer, Thomas Reed's folder waited exactly where I left it. I opened it carefully this time. Not because I needed reassurance. Because after tonight, I finally understood something with absolute clarity. Claire was no longer hoping for my house someday. She had already begun planning her life around taking it from me. The next morning, the house felt unusually still. Not peaceful. Suspended. Like something invisible had shifted overnight, and the walls themselves had noticed. I woke before sunrise and wandered downstairs in my robe, unable to sleep longer than a few hours at a time anymore. October light barely touched the windows. The kitchen carried the faint smell of coffee grounds and cold rain drifting through the screen door near the patio. I stood at the counter waiting for the kettle to boil when my phone vibrated softly against the granite surface. Margaret Ellis. I had known Margaret since 1978. We met during a school fundraiser when Claire was still in elementary school and Harold had more hair than patience. Some friendships survive because both people grow together. Ours survived because Margaret never lied to me. "You are awake early," she said after I answered. "So are you," I replied. There was a pause on the other end. Small. Careful. "I need to ask you something," Margaret said quietly. I leaned one hand against the counter. "All right. Did Claire tell you about the realtor?" The kettle began whistling softly behind me. I turned off the stove without taking my eyes off the dark kitchen window in front of me. "No," I said calmly. "She did not." Margaret exhaled heavily. "Evelyn, I was hoping I was wrong." I carried my tea into Harold's study and closed the door gently before sitting down at his desk. "Tell me." 3 weeks ago, I saw Claire at an open house fundraiser downtown, Margaret said. She introduced Daniel to a realtor named Scott Mercer. I only overheard part of the conversation, but they were talking about riverfront properties and preparing a house for sale. My fingers tightened slightly around the warm ceramic mug. Did she mention my address? Not directly, Margaret admitted. But then Claire said something strange. She said, "Once my mother finally agrees, we can move quickly before spring." I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I was shocked anymore, because hearing betrayal repeated out loud somehow made it heavier every single time. Margaret continued carefully. "Evelyn, I almost called you that same night. But I kept telling myself maybe there was another explanation." "There was," I replied softly. "Greed." Silence settled between us for a moment. Then Margaret lowered her voice further. "There is something else." I looked toward the family photograph sitting on Harold's desk beside the lamp. Claire at age 12 smiling with missing front teeth after losing them during softball season. Harold's arm wrapped around both of us. We looked happy enough to trust forever back then. "Daniel asked my nephew about elder care attorneys last month," Margaret said. "Apparently they were researching ways to transition property ownership smoothly if a parent becomes unable to manage finances independently." I let out the smallest laugh. Not because anything felt funny, because suddenly every conversation from the past year rearranged itself inside my mind like puzzle pieces finally locking together. Claire insisting I should stop driving at night after I miss one freeway exit. Daniel offering to help organize my banking passwords during tax season. The sudden conversations about downsizing, safety, simpler living. None of it happened accidentally. "Evelyn," Margaret asked gently, "are you all right?" I stared down at the folder Thomas Reed prepared earlier that week. My name typed neatly across the front in black ink. Official. Final. Safe. "I am now," I answered quietly. Margaret hesitated. "What does that mean?" I smiled faintly to myself. "It means Harold knew our daughter better than I did." The line stayed silent. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. I opened the folder slowly and ran my fingertips across the signed documents inside. the trust transfer, the revised will, the irrevocable property, protections. Every signature completed 2 days before my birthday lunch. 2 days before Claire whispered about my house like it already belonged to her. The last thing Harold ever asked me to promise, I said softly, was that I would never let guilt make decisions for me. Outside the study window, wind carried red maple leaves across the backyard patio in slow circles. Autumn always looked beautiful right before everything changed completely. Claire thinks she is planning my future, I continued calmly. What she does not understand is that she already lost control of it. 3 days passed before Claire called me again. Long enough for anger to cool into strategy. Long enough for people like Claire to convince themselves they still controlled the situation. The call came Wednesday afternoon while I was trimming dead roses near the back fence. Autumn had nearly stripped the garden bare by then. Harold used to say roses needed patience more than talent. You could not bully them into blooming. Claire probably would never understand that kind of thing. My phone vibrated inside my coat pocket just as cold wind swept across the yard. I stared at her name on the screen for a moment before answering. Hello, Claire. Her voice sounded softer than usual. Careful. Mom, I think we should talk. I clipped another dying rose slowly before responding. We already did. No, she replied quickly. I mean properly. Without emotion. There it was again. As if emotion belonged only to me while manipulation somehow counted as logic. I walked toward the patio and sat down carefully in one of the wrought iron chairs Harold bought 20 years earlier from an antique store in Vermont. The metal creaked softly beneath me. What exactly would you like to discuss? I asked calmly. Claire hesitated briefly. Daniel and I found a beautiful senior living community about 15 minutes from us. I closed my eyes for 1 second against the cold wind. Not because the words hurt anymore. Because hearing your own child describe your removal from your life in such cheerful language creates a kind of exhaustion deeper than anger. It has private cottages, Claire continued quickly. A fitness center. Meal services. Transportation. There are even art classes twice a week. I looked across the backyard toward the maple trees lining the riverbank beyond the fence. Leaves drifted slowly into the water one by one. Quiet endings everywhere. You already toured the place? I asked. Last month, she admitted. Last month. Before my birthday. Before family dinner. Before pretending this conversation was spontaneous concern. I smiled faintly to myself. You seem very prepared. Claire mistook my calmness for surrender immediately. People usually do when they underestimate older women. Mom, this is not about taking anything from you, she said gently. We just think it makes sense financially and practically. Financially. There was the real word finally crawling into daylight. I stood and brushed dirt from my gloves slowly. Actually, I said softly, I was planning to meet with Thomas Reed tomorrow morning. Silence hit the line instantly. Sharp enough that I could almost hear Claire sitting upright wherever she was. Why? She asked too quickly. Estate planning, I replied. At my age, one should stay organized. Claire laughed nervously. Of course. That is smart. But her voice had changed now. Tightened. Anxious beneath the politeness. Because suddenly the conversation no longer felt controlled. I was also thinking about making a few long-term decisions regarding the property, I continued calmly. You know, Claire said carefully, Daniel and I would be happy to help manage things if it becomes overwhelming. Help manage things. Such elegant language for ownership. I stepped back into the house through the patio door and locked it behind me. Warm air wrapped around me, instantly carrying the familiar scent of old books and cedar wood. That is thoughtful, I replied. But I think your father already helped me make the important decisions before he passed. Another pause. Longer this time. What does that mean? Claire asked quietly. I glanced toward Harold's study down the hallway. The folder inside his desk remained exactly where I left it. Every document signed. Witnessed. Protected. It means your father believed preparation matters. I answered. Claire's breathing shifted faintly through the phone. Tiny changes reveal fear faster than words ever do. Mom, she said carefully. You are not planning to do something irrational, are you? I almost laughed then. Irrational. The woman secretly researching assisted living facilities and realtors was questioning my judgment. "No, Claire," I replied softly. "Actually, for the first time in a very long while, I think very clearly." We ended the call politely after that. No shouting. No dramatic accusations. Just two women speaking carefully around the truth like people walking across thin ice. But after I hung up, I noticed something important. Claire had stopped sounding confident. Fear had entered her voice for the first time. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing access. And those are two very different things entirely. Thursday morning arrived colder than expected. Frost covered the edges of the backyard grass, turning everything pale silver beneath the early sunlight. I woke before 6 and sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee warming my hands while the house remained completely silent around me. At my age, silence changes meaning. When you are young, silence feels lonely. When you are older, it becomes information. And lately, silence had been telling me everything my daughter refused to say directly. At 9:05, I parked outside Thomas Reed's office downtown. The same brick building Harold used for business meetings for nearly 20 years. Walking through those front doors still felt strangely familiar. The scent of old paper and polished wood. The quiet hum of printers behind closed offices. Memory lingers in places long after people disappear from them. Thomas stood as soon as I entered his office. He had aged considerably since Harold's funeral. More gray hair. Slower movements. But his eyes remained sharp beneath his reading glasses. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "you look well." "That makes one of us," I replied softly, and he laughed under his breath. His office overlooked Main Street where people hurried along sidewalks carrying scarves and coffee cups against the cold. Ordinary lives continuing outside while mine quietly rearranged itself behind legal paperwork and polite conversations. Thomas closed the office door carefully before sitting across from me at his desk. "I reviewed everything again this morning," he said. "The trust is secure. The property transfer has already been recorded with the county." I nodded once. Calmly, the way people do when they already made peace with difficult decisions before arriving. "And Claire?" I asked. Thomas removed his glasses slowly. "She cannot force a sale. She cannot access the house through probate. Legally speaking, your assets are fully protected now." Protected. Such a strange word. I spent 40 years believing family itself was protection. Funny how life teaches certain lessons late. Thomas folded his hands together carefully. "Are you absolutely certain about naming Sophie primary beneficiary?" I looked toward the window for a moment. Cars moved steadily below us through morning traffic while sunlight reflected faintly against nearby office buildings. "Sophie still sees people clearly," I said quietly. "That matters." Thomas studied me for a second longer before nodding. "Harold would agree with you." Hearing his name still created that familiar ache somewhere beneath my ribs. Softer now than grief used to be. More like an old bruise than an open wound. Harold knew Claire better than I wanted to, I admitted. Thomas leaned back slowly in his chair. "Your husband updated several protections after Claire and Daniel moved into that investment property 3 years ago." I turned toward him immediately. "What do you mean?" Thomas opened a file folder from his desk drawer and slid one page gently toward me. Harold's signature rested near the bottom in dark blue ink. Steady. Certain. Harold became concerned after Daniel asked unusual questions regarding joint ownership structures and inheritance timing. Thomas explained carefully. My chest tightened slightly. "He never told me that." "He did not want to hurt you," Thomas said softly. "Of course he did not. Harold spent his entire life trying to shield me from disappointment whenever possible. Even disappointment wearing our daughter's face." Thomas hesitated briefly before continuing. "There is one more thing you should know." I waited silently. "Claire contacted my office yesterday afternoon." I felt no shock this time, only confirmation. "What did she want?" "She requested a meeting regarding future estate planning concerns," Thomas replied. "Specifically, concerns about your capacity to independently manage large assets." Capacity. The word settled coldly into the room between us. There it was. The real strategy finally exposing itself fully. Not help. Not concern. Control. I stared down at Harold's signature on the document in front of me, while something inside me went very still. Did she sound worried? I asked quietly. Thomas gave the faintest smile. No. She sounded impatient. I laughed once under my breath. Small. Tired. That sounds more accurate. Thomas leaned forward slightly, then lowering his voice. Evelyn, if Claire attempts legal pressure, these documents will hold. But emotionally, he stopped himself carefully. I finished the sentence for him. Emotionally, it still costs something. He nodded silently. Outside the office window, church bells somewhere downtown rang 10 o'clock across the cold autumn morning. I gathered my gloves from the desk slowly and stood. Thank you, Thomas. He walked me toward the office door. For what? I rested one hand lightly against the frame before answering. For helping me understand the difference between being loved and being managed. When I stepped back onto Main Street, the wind cut sharply through my coat. People passed around me carrying shopping bags and briefcases without noticing the older woman standing quietly on the sidewalk, holding her future safely inside a leather folder. Across the street, my phone began vibrating inside my purse. Claire. Again. I let it ring until the screen went dark. Claire arrived at my house unannounced the following Saturday just after noon. I knew it was her before I even opened the door because nobody else knocked with that kind of confidence. 3 sharp taps. Impatient. Certain the door would open eventually because she believed everything in this family still belonged to her in some way. Outside, the sky hung low and gray above the river. November cold had settled fully into Connecticut by then. The maple trees along the driveway stood nearly bare now, their branches thin and black against the afternoon clouds. Claire stood on the porch wearing a camel-colored wool coat and dark sunglasses despite the lack of sunlight. Daniel waited inside the SUV at the curb with the engine still running. That detail alone told me this visit had been planned carefully. Temporary. Transactional. Mom, Claire said brightly as I opened the door. I was nearby and thought we should clear the air. I stepped aside calmly without answering immediately. Claire walked inside carrying the scent of expensive perfume and cold air behind her. Her eyes moved quickly across the foyer before landing on Harold's framed photograph near the staircase. She barely glanced at it. The house feels darker lately, she commented casually while removing her gloves. You should really think about updating some things. I closed the front door softly. Some things do not need updating. Claire smiled tightly. That depends who you ask. We moved into the living room where weak afternoon light filtered through the tall windows overlooking the river. Harold's old reading chair still sat near the fireplace beside the brass floor lamp. He repaired himself every winter. Claire remained standing instead of sitting. Another signal. She had not come to reconnect. She came to accomplish something. I spoke with Daniel, she began carefully. And honestly, we are worried this situation is becoming unhealthy. I sat quietly on the sofa and folded my hands together in my lap. What situation would that be? Claire removed a folded stack of papers from her purse and placed them gently on the coffee table between us. Professional documents. Typed. Prepared. These are preliminary planning forms, she explained. Nothing official yet. Yet, Daniel's colleague recommended a wonderful financial transition advisor who specializes in helping seniors simplify long-term asset management. Seniors. Assets. Management. Every sentence stripped another layer of humanity away from me until I sounded less like a mother and more like a complicated investment account. I looked down calmly at the papers without touching them. You brought legal paperwork into my home without asking me first? Claire sighed dramatically and sat across from me at last. Mom, please stop acting like this is an attack. Then explain what it is. Claire leaned forward immediately. It is reality. You are 68 years old living alone in a house that is worth over $1 million. Dad is gone. Maintaining this property makes no sense anymore. There it was again. Not grief for Harold. Not concern for me. Just arithmetic. I studied my daughter's face quietly while she spoke. The same blue eyes Harold used to call beautiful when she was little. The same hands I once held crossing elementary school parking lots during winter snowstorms. Strange how familiarity can survive long after trust dies. You already contacted Thomas Reed, I said calmly. Claire froze. Only slightly. But enough. What? You requested a meeting regarding my financial competency. The color drained slowly from her face beneath perfect makeup. Mom, Did you really think he would hide that from me? Silence spread through the room instantly. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Claire stood again too quickly this time. You are twisting everything, she snapped. Daniel and I are trying to protect this family. I looked toward the river beyond the windows where dead leaves drifted slowly across dark water. No, I said softly. You are trying to secure your future before I decide what to do with mine. Claire stared at me as though she no longer recognized the woman sitting in front of her. Maybe she did not. Maybe quiet people become frightening once they finally stop apologizing for seeing things clearly. You are making a mistake, she said coldly. I smiled then. Small. Calm. Certain. No, Claire, I replied quietly. That already happened years ago. I simply raised it. Claire left my house without another word that afternoon. The front door closed harder than necessary behind her, and a second later I heard the SUV pull away from the curb with sudden speed. I remained seated in the living room long after the sound disappeared down the street. The papers she brought still rested untouched on the coffee table beside Harold's old reading glasses. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor in long pale strips, fading slowly as clouds moved over the river outside. Funny how quickly a home changes once you finally stop confusing tension for love. I carried the documents into the kitchen eventually, and placed them directly into the recycling bin beneath the sink. Not dramatically. Calmly. Like throwing away expired coupons or junk mail. Some things only have power while you keep treating them carefully. That evening Sophie called just after 7. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. Grandma. Hello, sweetheart. She hesitated for several seconds before speaking again. Mom is really upset. I leaned against the kitchen counter holding the cordless phone while soup warmed quietly on the stove behind me. I imagine she is. Sophie exhaled shakily. She said you embarrassed her. I smiled faintly to myself. No, Sophie. The truth embarrassed her. Those are different things. Silence settled softly between us. I could hear distant television noise somewhere in the background on her end of the line. Then Sophie lowered her voice carefully. Grandma, did Mom really try to take your house? Children ask direct questions adults spend years avoiding. Your mother convinced herself she was helping me, I replied quietly. Sometimes people repeat something selfish often enough that eventually they start believing it sounds loving. Sophie did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke again, her voice trembled slightly. I do not want to become like that. My chest tightened unexpectedly then. Not from pain this time. From recognition. Sophie still feared losing her kindness, which meant she had not lost it yet. You will not, I told her softly. Because you are asking yourself that question at all. Outside the kitchen window, darkness settled fully over the river. The maple trees had become shadows against the night sky now, thin black branches swaying under cold November wind. Grandma, Sophie asked again after a moment. Yes. Mom said you changed your will. There it was. The real subject finally arriving. I stirred the soup slowly with one hand while holding the phone with the other. Your grandfather and I made some decisions together before he passed, I said carefully. Important decisions. Sophie grew quiet again. Then softly, almost guiltily, she asked, was I really included? I closed my eyes briefly. Harold always said Sophie listened like someone trying to protect fragile things. Yes, I answered. You were. A long silence followed. Then I heard her crying very quietly on the other end of the line. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The kind of crying people do when they realize love and money have become tangled together in ways that make everyone feel ashamed. Grandma, she whispered, I do not care about the house. I know, I replied immediately. That is exactly why you deserve it. The line stayed silent except for her breathing. Finally she asked the question that mattered most. Are we still a family? I looked around the kitchen slowly. At Harold's coffee mug still hanging beside mine near the stove. At the old clock above the pantry he forgot to reset every daylight savings season. At the life we built piece by piece inside these walls before greed ever entered the room. Families change, I said softly. But the people who truly love you never make you feel like a transaction. After we hung up, I carried my soup into the living room and sat beside the fireplace beneath the soft glow of Harold's reading lamp. The house felt quiet again, but no longer suspended, no longer uncertain, just honest. For the first time in years, I realized something important. Peace does not always arrive when people apologize. Sometimes peace arrives the moment you stop allowing yourself to be managed by those who mistake your kindness for weakness. Across the room, Harold's photograph caught the light from the lamp beside it. I smiled softly toward him and rested my head back against the chair. Claire thought age had made me fragile. What she never understood was that surviving disappointment for nearly 70 years does not weaken a woman. It teaches her exactly when to stop opening the door.